Welcome to the second day of the Symposium, Andy Warhol After Pop. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And as you all hopefully already know, the impetus for this symposium is the first American Warhol retrospective in 30 years, Andy Warhol From A to B and Back Again, which is currently on view at the Whitney. Curated by Donna DeSalvo, the show considers the full arc of Warhol's artistic practice, beginning with his commercial work in the 1950s and touching on every period and every medium that Warhol worked in. And two notes. One is, if you haven't seen the show, it's up for another month until March 31st is the last day. And we're open till 10 p.m. tonight if you want to go see the show after we adjourn here at 2:33. Lots of time. And also, if you weren't here for all of yesterday, and especially, I want to just note that Donna gave a great overview and kind of talk through of the show, and we are live streaming. We've been live streaming, so you can catch that on our YouTube channel if you missed it, and you can also go back and watch yesterday's proceedings there as well. So I won't rehearse everything I said yesterday, but just to note, the exhibition devotes substantial attention to a period of Warhol's work that has not defined his art historical or popular reputation, the 2 decades of activity following the attempt on his life by Valerie Solanas in 1968. We chose to focus the symposium on this period as it is also the most fertile ground for new scholarship on Warhol. Hopefully you all agree with that now, having heard some of the talks, and I think you'll hopefully agree after you hear it today too. Yesterday's sessions produced fascinating new insights and some discussion, although not enough, so we're really looking forward to continuing those conversations today. Thank you again to all the speakers for sharing your research and thinking with us. Thank you to Donna for your ambitious and generous vision for this exhibition and everything it has engendered. Thank you also to the Visual Studies program at Lang for hosting us in this beautiful room. We're grateful to be collaborating with the new school community, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce So-Young Yoon, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Visual Studies and program director of Visual Studies here, and she's also helped to nurture this collaboration between the Whitney and the New School with me over the last 5 years. And I'm really thrilled that she's moderating this first panel this morning. Part of why this collaboration has been so fruitful probably is also because So-Young is a visiting faculty at the Whitney Museum of American Art's Independent Study Program, or the ISP. She received her PhD from Stanford University and holds a BA from Seoul National University. She is currently at work on 2 book projects around the redefinition of the document from the post-war period to the present. One is entitled Walkie Talkie. The other is entitled TV Buddhas. She is published in Grey Room, Discourse, Women in Performance, Millennium Film Journal, among other journals and books. And her essay around Mendy and Keith Obadike's Number Station, Do a Number, the Facticity. So the title of the essay is Do a Number, the Facticity of the Voice or Reading, Stop and Frisk Data, was awarded a Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. So please join me in welcoming So-Young.
So thank you very much. So thank you all for joining us on this snowy Saturday morning to participate in day 2 of the symposium on the significance of Warhol's later work. As an introduction to this session's theme of collaboration, I would like to begin by asking how this symposium has posed not only the question of Warhol's singularity, but also his contemporaneity. Not only who is Warhol, but also where is Warhol and what do we want of Warhol? Donna DeSalvo's exhibition has offered us an extraordinary opportunity to test and confirm this contemporaneity. And especially for my students in the audience, just wait and see all the close-ups I've taken of lines and slops and squirts and sloshes of paint. Or rather, don't wait, and please see the exhibition again before it closes at the end of the month on March 31st. We can also attest to Warhol's contemporaneity by the intensity and enthusiasm of the audience for the exhibition. The lines wrapped several times around the museum, especially on weekends and on Pay What You Wish Day, as well as the easy and effective appropriation of Warhol's pop art as the very style of institutional critique in recent protests around the Whitney Museum and the role of art and cultural institutions in their complicity with structural violence, so explicitly demonstrated by the Trump administration. To riff on a quotation from yesterday's discussions, in times as explicit and as reductive as these, your choice seems to have been reduced to two: to look or to look away. And as soon you will hear from our panelists, if this morning's theme is collaboration, the panel attends to not only collaboration as a working together, a working alongside, a working with, but also collaboration as collusion, a working with the enemy or the other. In this question of Warhol's contemporaneity, we've seen and heard how Warhol appears as not only an artist, but as a figure of the artist, and what he offers to the problem of authorship and models of expressivity that his work and method of working offers, especially in relationship to the seriality of his work, its play of difference and repetition, as well as in relationship to his incessant, relentless recording of everyday life. Questions have been posed as to which medium do we privilege in our approach to grasping Warhol's voice? Would it be via painting, photography, cinema, the film still, the televisual screen, or the audio tape? As well as questions about how to pose the problem of agency in relationship to Warhol's voice, the hyperarticulation in the work's reflection of the conditions of its own working in advanced capitalism. Is it an active voice, or is it a passive voice? Is it one of alienation or freedom or both? I suggest that the forthcoming panel on collaboration further complicates this question of agency by paying special attention to Warhol's particular deployment of mediums of not only recording, but also transmission, circulation, and exchange, a kind of collaboration, if you will. And we take our cue from how Donna De Salvo's exhibition opens with two early images of currency, mediums of circulation from 1962, namely 192 $1 bills and the S&H green stamps. Now, the scholar Bernhard Sigurd has argued that we foreground this aspect of transmission, circulation, and exchange in the transformations of modern literature. And his example is Franz Kafka. So in addition to the comparison to Duchamp, I'm now putting Kafka onto the table. His example is Franz Kafka, and he proposes that we consider Kafka's literature in relationship to his incessant, relentless letter writing and his use and abuse of the technologies of the modern postal system. And to shift the emphasis from not what Kafka wrote and meant, but how it was received. How was the reception and reading accounted for in Kafka's sending and writing, especially in the case of of his love letters in which he was able to calculate through his knowledge of the postal system, like when his lovers would receive the letters or not. As the scholar Michel Cournot notes, quote, this correspondence demonstrates exactly how one being may touch, enchain, torture, enslave, and destroy another being by the systemic and total use of the postal and telegraphic surfaces. Or as Sigurd would put it, mail was not a means for correspondence, but precisely the opposite, a means to give answers that did not correspond, to fire off speech acts that blew themselves into pieces. We move them from the back and forth of intimate confessional speech to the exchange and circulation of information, from the question of what do you mean to can you hear me? Can you hear me now? If I am proposing in relationship to the forthcoming panel a consideration of Warhol as a discourse network, as yet another inflection of this oft-quoted, I want to be a machine, I also want to highlight that to talk about mediums of transmission, exchange, and circulation is also to talk about bodies in circulation. That is, to talk about technology is to also talk about the global division of labor and the supply chain, as well as environmental depletion and waste. the historian Jill Lepore, most recently in her essay entitled The Robot Caravan, talks about how fantasies of technology have historically always been intertwined with the fascination, fear, and anxiety about immigration. Quote, they raged against the machine, they fought for the color line, end quote. So as I nod towards Ken Oshiki's closing presentation last night about Warhol's work in relationship to maintenance, its upkeep of the fantasy of America and the exhaustion of such upkeep, I want to highlight another power relationship that will be foregrounded, like in this panel, not only the relationship between employer and employee via gender, sexuality, and desire, but also of race and class. And I'd like to end with a nod to a different kind of shadow that opened our conference, namely the shadow, like from the radio plays, and particularly how the poet Amiri Baraka talks about his love of the figure of the shadow, his listening of radio, but also being aware that the shadow becomes a disavowed, unacknowledged embodiment of the fear and fascination for blackness, in America. So to quote the last of In Memory of Radio from 1961, what was it he used to say about the transformation what was it he used to say after the transformation when he was safe and invisible and the unbelievers couldn't throw stones? Hey, 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 who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. Oh, yes, he does. Oh, yes, he does. An evil word it is, this love. So on that note, please allow me to introduce the panelists according to the order of presentation, which will be by alphabetical order. So we'll begin with Jonathan Flatley's presentation. Jonathan Flatley lives in Detroit, where he is a professor of English at Wayne State University. He is author of Affective Mapping, Melancholia and the Politics of Modernism, and Like Andy Warhol. He was the co-editor with Jennifer Doyle and Jose Munoz of Pop Out Queer Warhol, and with Anthony Gridden of a special issue of Criticism from 2014 on Warhol. He is currently working on 2 books, one on Black Leninism and the other on Reading for Mood. And his current paper will draw from his book Like Andy Warhol. Our next speaker is Ricardo Montes. He's an assistant professor of performance studies in the Schools of Public Engagement at the New School, where he has developed curricular programs for the study of race, ethnicity, and gender and sexuality. Prior to joining the faculty at the New School, he held the Cotson Race and Ethnicity Postdoctoral Fellowship in the Princeton Society of Fellows. His monograph on the artist Keith Haring, titled Keith Haring's Line, Race and Performance of Desire, is forthcoming from Duke University Press, and his presentation will also draw from his forthcoming book. And lastly, our last presentation will be with Lucy Mulroney, who is the Associate Director of the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library of Yale University. Her writing has been published in The Believer, Counter Signals, Grey Room, and Criticism, among other places. Her new book, entitled Andy Warhol, Publisher, provides the first in-depth study of Warhol's career-long involvement in publishing, and we'll also hear, a part of her presentation will also draw from her book. And in addition to her book on Warhol, Mulroney has curated exhibitions including Strange Victories, Grove Press from 1951 to 85, which trace the evolution of the publishing house from obscenity trial to feminist strike, and Black Utopias, co-curated with Joan Bryant, which took the 50th anniversary of the publication of the autobiography of Malcolm X as the impetus for an exploration of the utopian visions that have circulated in Black communities since the antebellum period. So on that note, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Jonathan Flatley. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to Donna, and thanks especially to Izzy for all her practical, assistance demonstrated right there. Let me start timing myself. I'm going to try to stay at 25 minutes if I can. The title of my paper today is borrowed from Marsha P. Johnson. That's Warhol and Johnson there, who, as we know, was one of the sitters for Warhol's Ladies and Gentlemen series of paintings, drawings, prints, and collages. In 1974 and 1975, when these works were made, Saint Marcia, as she was sometimes known, was already a star. Renowned as a key participant in the 1969 Stonewall riots, and then as one of the founders in 1970, along with her friend Sylvia Rivera, of the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. Drawing on the activist energy surrounding the Gay Liberation Front's efforts to build a new liberated lifestyle in which the old gender role system would no longer be necessary, STAR sought to address the particular concerns of street transvestites who are not always represented by gay liberation, which is famously and vividly pointed out in a famous speech by Sylvia Rivera at a gay pride event, which you can find on YouTube. STAR campaigned against police harassment, for the improvement of unsafe, violent prison conditions, for the rights of transvestites, who would now be called transgender persons, to engage in public sex and to occupy the streets, and more generally for transgender rights. Johnson knew that the creation of such a world would require more than just modest changes to the political and social order. STAR is a very revolutionary group, she noted in a 1973 interview. We believe in picking up the gun, starting a revolution if necessary. If STAR aimed to remake the world into one in which its members would be valued and free, it also gave concrete form to the other world that it anticipated in STAR House, which provided food and shelter for transgender youth. The queer kinship and affiliation that we see there was also a group practice aimed towards survival in the present. In doing this, Johnson suggests, STAR was not necessarily inventing a new mode of being together, so much as giving explicit political and institutional form to a mode of togetherness that already brought street transvestites together. Usually most transvestites are friendly towards one another, Johnson said, because they're just alike. If transvestites aren't all the same, they are alike, and this is what made them friendly toward one another. It was the basis of their togetherness, she suggests. And here's Marcia Johnson on the left here with Sylvia Rivera, the two co-founders of STAR. Given his long-standing commitment to being alike and to liking, which is what my book is about, as liking as a kind of praxis, a praxis characterized by a fundamental and indiscriminately broad affective openness that was based on an appreciation of likeness. Given that, I think Warhol was well positioned to appreciate the form of being together that Johnson saw among transgender persons. What I want to suggest today is that his Ladies and Gentlemen series and its formal practices, in that series, Warhol sought to create an aesthetic world where a collectivity such as stars could find a home. And in so doing, he would create a space in which he felt valued and welcome as well. So just as Warhol's screen test provided documentary of the group brought together or documentation of the group brought together of the factory in the mid-1960s, so his portraits of drag queens offer a remarkable picture of a specific collectivity of mostly Black and Latinx transvestites. These are some of the prints that he did, and this is from the Italian catalog. That Warhol was excited about documenting the group as a group is suggested by the unprecedented scale of the sittings for this commission, which produced more than 500 Polaroids of 14 drag queens, all of which are reproduced, I would say, I would like to add in Neil Prince's catalog, Raisonné, which really does a fantastic and gorgeous job documenting the series and how Warhol made it. The series resulted also in 268 paintings, a portfolio of prints, and a number of drawings and collages. He began work on the series in the summer of 1974 at the suggestion, as Neil noted yesterday, of an Italian art dealer, Luciano Anselmino, who would have known about Warhol's long-standing interest in drag and been familiar with the significant role played in many of Warhol's films. by figures such as Mario Montez, Candy Darling, Jackie Curtis, and Holly Woodlawn. Bob Colacello remembers that after initially resisting the proposal, Warhol was worried that if he painted Holly and Jackie, they would ask for money every time a painting sold. Warhol arrived at the idea of putting the mostly black and Puerto Rican drag queens from the painting the mostly black and Puerto Rican drag queens from the Gilded Grape Bar, which he sometimes frequented. Here's Colacello. Ronnie Cutrone, Vincent Fremont, and I would ask them to pose for a friend for $50 per half hour. The next day they'd appear at the factory, and Andy, who we never introduced by name, would take their Polaroids. Colacello then adds the following crack, that the next time we saw them at the Gilded Grape, they would invariably say, "Tell your friend I do a lot more for $50. As poor Black or Latinx gay and gender nonconforming street transvestites who earned money hustling, Warhol's sitters were a multiply marginalized group, which means, obviously, that there's a clear power imbalance in the terms of the collaboration between Warhol and his sitters here. The value that Warhol got from these sittings was greater than what he paid for, what he was willing to pay his sitters. And Warhol knew that his friends Holly and Jackie knew it, which is why he wouldn't paint them. Certainly, Warhol is extracting value from his transgender models, taking advantage of the existing market, and by paying the going wage for their time. Of course, this is a huge theme in art history, the painting of prostitutes, the availability of prostitutes for models, and a huge theme in Warhol's scholarship. Think of his film My Hustler, especially as Warhol himself was often accused of being a madam or of prostituting himself, or by working for hire, which that whole thematic, I won't talk about that today, but I would refer you to Jennifer Doyle's work. So even though, as I'll suggest, these paintings affirm the work of drag and of these particular drag queens, who he sought to present as stars, adding them to the pantheon next to Marilyn, Liz, and the others, these are works of art, authored by Warhol, and he was the one getting the nearly $1 million commission. But I'm glad these paintings, drawings, and prints exist. Indeed, sometimes I think they're the best thing that Warhol did. Even as we must acknowledge the inequality that is their condition of possibility, they also speak against that inequality and for the collectivity that would need to come together to abolish it. And they do that precisely to the extent that these works are mimetically and affectively open to the joyous and defiant glamour of Broadway, Isha, Yvette, Kim, Lourdes, Monique, Vicky, Alfonso Pinel, Helen, or Harry Morales, Marsha P. Johnson, Wilhelmina Ross, Iris, and Michelle. And they are effectively open in ways, I think, that remain relevant to our efforts to think about collective queer politics today, and indeed perhaps any queer politics. I was going to say a word about the Italian catalog, which you can see here, which also collected a number of writings in the Black radical tradition and presented a kind of melancholic Warhol as its frontispiece. For Warhol's part, in an interview published in the gay literary magazine Christopher Street in 1977, this is Warhol, "I used to go to the Gilded Grape Bar, and the transvestites there were just so exciting looking. I decided to do some paintings of them." Part of what might have made the drag queen so exciting looking is the combination of impressive mimetic skill and intense affective attachment to female glamour that Warhol found compelling in drag more generally. And I want to consider his thinking about drag for a moment before returning to the works in the series. So for Warhol, and this is point one, drag is fundamentally rooted in an experience of spectatorship in which viewers can imagine being, acting, and looking like a star. In order to adopt the movie star one likes as a model, of course, repeated viewings, intense study, and multiple imitations are necessary, and I tend to see this Marilyn diptych, among other things, as an effort to represent those multiple imitations. As a consequence, Warhol observes, as a consequence of this sort of intense study that's necessary to imitate the model, this is Warhol and the philosophy, and if Melissa's here, she can tell us if she's listened to the tapes, if this is really Warhol, if this is Pat Hackett. It sounds a little bit more like Pat Hackett. Drags are ambulatory archives of ideal movie star womanhood. They perform a documentary service, actually consecrating their lives to keeping the glittering alternative alive and available for not too close inspection. In the drag queen, that is, bodily comportment itself records an accumulation of likes. The gestures, facial expressions, styles of speech, modes of dressing, and ways of walking that have become sites of affective attachment and imitation. The drag queens thereby perform a scholarly, pedagogical function, keeping alive and making available what Warhol calls the glittering alternative. And they show others how they too can access this alternative and in fact bring the glitter into the realm of everyday life. Warhol also admired, and this is point 2, the difficult labor performed by boys who spend their lives trying to be complete girls. These boys, he writes, have to work so hard, double time, getting rid of all the telltale male signs and drawing in all the female signs. They have to work double time, right, both erasing signs and drawing in signs. And for this reason, as boys who look like girls, drag queens display for Warhol a striking, self-conscious capacity for the creation of likenesses across the boundary of sexual difference, which is otherwise vigorously policed. Instead of being failures, thus, to be a gender, for Warhol, drag queens are beacons of mimetic talent, as well as exemplars of the commitment and courage required to defy social norms. Of course, male femininity would have been exciting for Warhol in part because it echoed his own failures to correctly play the proper role and his own ongoing, often recounted identification with femininity, powerfully elaborated in these 1981 photos. The labor required to look like a woman was in some ways also an intensification of the daily blemish erasing, skin recoloring makeup labor that Warhol recounted at the beginning of his philosophy. It's like he spends 10 pages talking about his morning routine in front of the mirror. Warhol admired the labor of drag because he was familiar with it. As we know, Warhol was also a wearer of showy wigs, and with the objection that could hover behind this performance if the wig fell off or one failed to get one's makeup right. The case I want to make briefly here, as I suggested, is that in his works, Warhol recognizes, affirms, and imitates the artwork involved in drag, which is itself a spectatorial work in as much as it involves imitating stardom. First of all, and this is most obvious, but it must be pointed out, the models were each captured in winning star turn poses. This is Isha that Neil talked about yesterday. They look good. And when the Polaroids were transformed into drawings here, this is Wilhelmina Ross, or paintings, we see that Warhol has assisted and amplified the drag queen's self-presentation by excising those male signs that the drag queens may have themselves not managed to get rid of. And there's like no Adam's apple in this drawing, right? I mean, and instead it's the scarf that gets all the drawing attention in ways that Neil discussed yesterday, and the lips, the scarf and the lips. You can see in this portrait of Helen Morales also that lips, eyes, eyeshadow, hair all jump out. Right? In other words, he also redoubles the drawing in of female signs. But the use of color here, you might notice, as throughout the series, is notable in several ways. First of all, in the sense that the color is often like the wrong color. So you don't expect to see this like extra blue around the red lips. You might instead expect to find a flat surface or a bit of subtle shading around the mouth and under the cheekbones. But this is also, we might remember, where in a photo we might see stubble or the efforts to hide it. Instead, we find here this bright blue, which flamboyantly also exaggerates the lips. Look here at these lips. And it announces itself as flamboyant, as completely artificial. But then we do look at the lips, and there they are, slightly parted, ready to accept a cigarette. And we see that the screen printed over doesn't quite match up with the color painted underneath, and her lips are half pink. But this offness, rather than looking bad, I think draws our eyes. We look closer, we spend more time on those lips, through which we can now see the traces of Warhol's fingers, which in fact run around the entire face, mixing the colors as they go. And this is a place to remark on another key feature of these paintings, which is their notable layeredness. Neil Prince notes how, with this body of work, Warhol began with a base layer of color over the primer instead of white. That is, he abandons the aesthetic principle that we can see in his earlier works of white as a neutral, unmarked background. Instead, like his models, he begins with a non-white color as the given. While it's difficult to know how the underlayers concretely affected the overall look of the paintings, the layeredness itself is on display. The edges of brushstrokes, congealed lines, drops of paint are apparent, sometimes dramatically so, on most of these paintings, including this one. Even more apparent, I think, are the grooves and ridges created by Warhol's fingers that I mentioned that are very apparent here on Helen's lips, which emphasize their texture and also emphasize the texture of the painting itself. This is something that can be touched. Another effect here is that the ridges and grooves also often disrupt the screen that goes on over the paint, producing little skips or additional black lines. And I would have prepared a close-up, but I failed to. Of the lips here, you can sort of see how the lines right in there produce these sort of variations or sort of skips in the silk screen that goes over. Like a stubborn Adam's apple, a bit of beard, or oddly colored patch of skin, and I'm thinking of Warhol's own, a disruptive physicality peeks through and prevents the face from being fully defined. But in coming to the surface, it does not mar so much as form compelling points of visual attraction. Rather than expose the places where these drag queens might have failed to cover over the signs of their masculinity, Warhol imitates and echoes them with his own painterly accidents, which create the surface, but also disrupt the sense that this surface is or could be unbroken or smooth. These beautiful and singular mistakes create points of similarity between the paintings, a reparative analog for the way a certain wrongness brought together the drag queens they represent. In a sense, that's the argument of my reading. He's sort of producing an aesthetic analog of the way the drag queens come together in Star. So, as an allegory of the work of drag, the mixing of layers on the surface suggests here also how repeated imitations involved in acquiring the gestures and comportment of a given gender model may function like a lapidary recovering that perceptually reorganizes the physical givens of a body, even as it also leaves visible to the attentive eye those givens that we now perceive differently. Drag performance in these works is fragmented, mixed, complex, and gorgeous. As if Warhol is showing us the shards of shimmering affective intensity lying just underneath and animating aspects of pose and expression, an effort often amplified by bright, abstract blocks of color on the face or hands. And here we see a collage that was the basis of one of the prints, and this is Iris. Drag subjectivity, especially in Warhol's collages, is composed not by the skin as a cover, nor ever by some authentic interior that's like being expressed, but by the patches of visibly torn, borrowed color, disidentificatorily mixed or collaged together. By following their work with his, Warhol's portraiture not only imitates the drag queen's practice, but participates in it. I am like them, the paintings themselves seem to say, and I am like them in the way that they are like each other, participating yet failing in this project of imitating ideal movie star femininity yet while doing so, archiving and making present the possibility of a glittering alternative to this world. There's lots more to note about these paintings and the fantastic collection that I congratulate Donna on putting together for the show of these paintings. This is Wilhelmina Ross. In some ways, as Neil noted, she's the star of the series, not least in the sense that Warhol painted her more than any of his other models. But also here in the sense of, if you've seen the show, this painting is huge. It's not quite movie screen size, but certainly it's the size of the huge posters you see in the subway advertising the newest movie or play. It's the size reserved for stars. Many of these paintings, too, like this one, feature a face split into two colors, one darker than the other. And there's lots of ways to think about this, I think, but one thing it recalls in other of Warhol's work, this is one of the screen tests, 13 Most Beautiful Boys, is sort of dramatic shadowing that cuts off half of the face. These are from Chelsea Girls, and then that's Warhol portrait itself where he reproduces the same effect. But here, in the Wilhelmina and in the Alfonso Parnell painting, that's this one, the shadow's the wrong color. It's a little bit off, and the use of wrong color, I think, in those works, as in this Yvette and Lord paintings, is what brings them together. And here you see, and Neil has noted this also in the catalog Raisonné, this sort of luminescent green color around the edges is where you would expect to see shadow, but instead it's this sort of bright luminescent color. Like makeup, the bright paint here highlights certain zones of the painting's surface. However, this eye-catching color underscores the wrong spot, putting a pleasing artificiality on display. And I'll just say one word about this painting. That wrong color also sort of loops around them and brings them together. Whereas here, and this is the painting of them in the show, it's not a color that brings them together. They each sort of have their own color, but it's Yvette's hand. I feel like this painting is all about Yvette's hand and the way that it forms the point of the connection between the two of them in this kind of affectionate yet also melancholic and very intimate embrace, and the way that the sort of lines of that hand are then repeated just above it in the lines of Yvette's jaw, and then repeated up above that again in the lines of eyeshadow, which is to say, and this painting seems to be more about a sort of a painterly logic of correspondence, of bodies conforming to each other in shape, line, direction, and color. And I know that this is Diana Ross. Wilhelmina Ross named herself after Diana Ross. I just want to conclude by returning to Marcia Johnson. Of course, it goes without saying that in naming their organization STAR, Marcia P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera recognized and publicized the fact that their political, oppositional, communal, and activist way of being together rested, at least in part, on a shared imitation of and affection for stars. The non-whiteness of this stardom is interestingly underscored in Warhol's portrait of Johnson, especially in its presentation of Johnson's blonde wig. The wig, of course, is not just wrong, like any female wig on a man would be, but being blonde, it is also a charged sign of whiteness on a brown-skinned body. The wrongness of Johnson's possession of whiteness is amplified by the wig's pigtails, which usually signify youth and childhood, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, or Sandra Dee in the Tammy film franchise. Here, I see the wig as closer to Vaginal Davis's later use of blonde pigtail wigs, while performing here the foot fetish sex act of shrimping while wearing a Teutonic dirndl. This is campy pastiche, a little bit comic, perhaps, like Davis as Patty McCormick in Bad Seed regalia. But it's also a bit punk, too, flirting with the abject, like Betty Davis's messy pigtails in Baby Jane. That is, we see here a paradigmatic instance of what José Muñoz called disidentification, in which a partially or potentially toxic dominant structure is co-opted, worked on, and against. The Whig publicly performs a disidentification with whiteness, at once representing the desire to be white, referencing that desire, and showily announcing its failure, suggesting the degree to which that desire is not equally available or equally achievable to a person with brown skin who cannot approximate a fantasy ideal of white womanhood by dyeing her hair blonde, as Norma Jean Mortensen Baker did in becoming Marilyn Monroe. Warhol's works encourage us here and throughout the series to see these drag queens as engaged in a mimetic practice that reparatively and disidentificatorily reassembles fragmented codes of stardom, mixing and changing and recoloring them. This mimetic practice avows a brown and black stardom, one that these drag queens have both referenced and created, a stardom that powers the performances of femininity collected here, and which also provides a way for them to be with by being like each other, indeed to thereby form a collectivity capable of both daily comfort and political action. That is, to return to what Johnson said in the quote that I started with, usually most transvestites are friendly toward one another because they're just alike. Thanks.
So I am honored to be included in the symposium, and I want to chime in on the deep thanks to Donna DeSalvo for organizing a surprising, illuminating, and important show. I also want to thank Megan Hewer and Izzy Dow for making this symposium happen. I couldn't turn my mind off last night thinking about all of the challenging questions and perspectives on Warhol's art that were shared yesterday, and I'm super excited to hear more of them. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. Writing in his journals shortly after Andy Warhol's death, Keith Haring contemplates the impact Warhol had on his career. And in what he admits sounds like a, quote, pretentious or egotistical claim, argues, quote, I never thought anyone understood how to build on Andy's achievements, except Andy and maybe me. Not only in a formal way, but conceptually and with the same holistic approach and attitude, end quote. Haring believes that Warhol's line, his graphic sense, allowed Warhol to extend his artistic engagement with the world and popular culture seamlessly across multiple fields of production and media. The younger artist, mourning his mentor, sees the development of his own line, moving as it did between subway drawings, art galleries, and his commercial venture, the Pop Shop, as singular in its legacy to Warhol. In my book, Keith Haring's Line, I consider this legacy and argue that Haring mobilized Warhol's particular modes of pop reproduction to engage cross-racial desire, developing his line in relation to Black and Latinx bodies, while also physically mapping it onto the very geographies of contact that fueled his libidinal energies. Haring, inspired by the collaborative spirit of Warhol's factory, often worked with other artists to enact his line in multiple formats, including photography and performance. Driven as he was to work with people of color, the terms of these collaborative productions necessarily created and continued to pose problems around visibility and recognition. Seng Kwang Chi's photography, for example, is often seen as mere documentary evidence of Keith Haring's life and art, rather than the work of a skillful collaborator whose image production is as much a part of the art as Haring's painted line. So most people know Haring's line, I think, because, or Haring's production in the time of in New York City because of Seng Kwang Chi's photography, but they don't often acknowledge Seng as an artist in and of himself. Recognizing the potentially exploitative racial dynamics at play in collaboration, Bill T. Jones once insisted that photos of his naked body, covered in Haring's neo-primitive line work, be printed with a caption that explicitly named Jones as a choreographer, an attempt to not appear as, quote, just some black dude who Haring painted, end quote. In my consideration of collaborations, I'm interested in how artists are complicit, manufacturing images in relation to a continually reconstituted and reimagined elsewhere, those spaces of reception in which the images circulate, and those geographies that are part of the multiple and shared histories that shape them as subjects. And I was thinking a lot about Melissa's thinking through of redaction in terms of Pat Hackett's kind of relationship to the audio tapes is a really interesting space of complicity. I take my cue here around complicity from anthropology, particularly the work of George Marcus, who traces the various ways that complicity operates within the epistemic context of fieldwork. My book frames Haring's relationships as scenes of complicity rather than ones of collaboration, in an attempt to stress the dynamic uncertainty of intimate and creative exchange. Echoing Amber Jamila Musser's privileging of complicity over subversion in her recent analysis of scenes of masochistic play, I understand Haring's neo-primitive line as a graphic enactment, a visual aesthetic performative that conjures and draws subjects into a field of negotiations in which the outcome of participation and the agential terms of the subject cannot be forecast according to a perceived power imbalance or structural inequality. This frame allows a more nuanced reading of exchange when considering the field of contact between Haring and those bodies of color that were integral to his work. I want to turn to a particular site of complicit arrangements that currently hangs on the wall of the exhibit. This silkscreen of Keith Haring and Juan Dubose has been crucial to my methodological approach to archival research and the writing of a historical narrative around cross-racial contact. And so this is like the first time I actually got to see this work, and that's very exciting. A chemical reaction occurred. Andy Warhol pressed the button of his Polaroid, producing a flash and exposing gelatin silver to the light emanating, reflecting, and radiating from Keith Haring and Juan Dubose, his first significant lover. Their forms were caught, written out against a light, sensitive surface. Breathing, living beings, Haring and Dubose existed for Warhol, posing in their desire, allowing themselves to be captured by the artist, whose capture brought with it an inclusion in a glamorous world of socialites and celebrities. Haring and his black boyfriend, as Warhol would refer to Dubose in the diaries, are doubly written into a particular existence through the writing of light in the Polaroids and the speaking of a journal entry. Both documents would find their audience in mass production. The Polaroids were enlarged, the images rewritten in black and white on acetate as positive proofs. The acetate allowed for another light process. The silkscreen filter was created when the emulsion was exposed to intense UV light. Bright light shot through the acetate, hardening the chemical in those places where exposure occurred. The dark forms on the acetate resisted the passing of light. Washing the emulsion surface, those areas not exposed to light flowed away, leaving a screen image of the lovers. The silkscreen frame utilized a filter made of silk or synthetic material that mimics the single filament thread produced from the silkworm's mouth. Single filament material allowed ink to flow smoothly onto the canvas. And so the images of Haring and Dubose were written, rewritten, and painted onto a canvas surface. The effect is all the more powerful because this particular relationship can seem itself already written, scripted to fit a familiar story about race and power. Dubose's presence in Haring's life seems to follow an overly coherent narrative script. In Gruen's biography, Haring discusses his relationship with Dubose, and in the process claims that he is most comfortable in his intimacy with people of color. Quote, "My spirit and soul is much closer to the spirit and soul of people of color. And yes, I have an erotic attraction for people of color because there is no better way to be wholly a part of the experience than to be sexually involved. I firmly believe that a sexual relationship, a deep sexual relationship, is a way of truly experiencing another person and really becoming that other person. So I had that with Juan Dubose, who was a black person, and I became part of his life." Those in Haring's social network often comment on the ever-present dark-skinned boys who occupied his life. and Dubose stands at the origin of this pattern. He exists as a side of becoming for Haring in this anecdote, which explicitly ties erotic intimacy to the artist's racialized sense of self. Haring's sexual and professional engagements with people of color served as a stimulus for artistic production and personal fantasy throughout his adult life. His fetishization marked people of color as a potential source of freedom from whiteness and the violent histories of subjection that white people have perpetuated. Haring's own complicity within this historical framework remained relatively unproblematized as he figured his inner spirit and soul as different from those of other white people. Haring's liberal presumption to know the inner life of brown people and to imagine his contact with people of color as a means to become non-white reveals the context in which Dubose gets marked as a fetish. Precisely as a fetish, Dubose's place in Haring's life seems overly narratable, even tritely predictable. Exhausted from tooling around the baths and his failure to meet anyone with whom he could connect beyond sex, Haring reported his 1981 encounter with Dubose in rapturous, expectant terms, and his words conjure Dubose on a purely aesthetic level. Quote, "He's black, he's thin, he's the same height as me, and he's almost the same age," end quote. After great sex, Haring claimed this dark double as the right person. Dubose wrote his number on stationery from the St. Mark's Baths, and so began Haring's descent into love. A car stereo installer and DJ, Dubose enters the narrative of Haring's life through the recollection of others. Praised for his quiet beauty and cooking skills, Dubose oscillates between the role of sexual object and domestic caretaker. Samantha McEwen, who shared an apartment with the couple, told Gruen that Dubose was, quote, "the quietest, the most unassuming, beautiful, gentlest, and really mysterious guy." But her tone changes as she recounts the later years of the relationship. The creator of wonderful meals becomes a monosyllabic drug user who does little more than watch television. McEwen describes an increasingly introverted figure, an inverse image of Haring's increased productivity. Quote, "Keith was getting more and more active. Juan just retreated into himself, and it was a very sad thing to watch." Frustrated with Dubose's jealousy and supposed inactivity, Haring eventually left Dubose and began a relationship almost immediately with a Puerto Rican man named Juan Rivera, who remained his lover for several years. Years after the separation from Dubose, Haring received a call from Dubose's mother informing him that his former lover was dying. Haring visited Dubose in the hospital, trying to ensure that he was being treated appropriately for HIV infection. Dubose passed away shortly after the visit, and Haring proceeded to get people to come to the wake in Harlem. Haring recorded in his journals the difficulty he had telling his friends that Dubose had died, writing that it felt like the equivalent of announcing his own death. At the wake, Haring's fears of the open casket were assuaged when he glimpsed Dubose and was able to reassure himself that, quote, "he looks so beautiful." In the summary I have offered of Dubose's existence in Haring's authorized biography and published journals, Dubose's entrance and exit neatly confine him to a secondary timeline to that of the more prolific and famous. As an artist, Haring engaged Dubose's fleshly existence in part as a way to further his own racialized fantasy of interior actualization, repeatedly articulating the terms of Dubose's presence within the structure of his own fame. Haring's friends, too, paint a portrait of Dubose that is clearly wedded to and filtered through Haring's desire and career. Warhol's diaries, which discuss the remarkable photo shoot with Dubose in some detail, do the same. In an entry dated August 18, 1983, Warhol states that, quote, "Keith Haring came by with his black boyfriend and I took pictures. They were so lovey-dovey in the photos, it was nutty to see," end quote. By the time Haring posed for Warhol, he was rapidly becoming part of the glamorous world of icons Warhol had been documenting and reproducing for years. He fit perfectly in the collection of stars and fashionable figures that populated scenes of excess, wealth, and beauty, a rendering of exclusivity and performed exception that mimicked the countercultural, self-produced importance of Warhol's earlier days. Haring's increasing fame and the ubiquity of his work would soon generate a publicity machine that inserted his face and art into the everyday lives of millions around the world. As René Ricard had predicted in the 1981 Peace and Art Forum, Keith Haring himself would become a trademark sign in circulation. Haring's inclusion in Warhol's stable of subjects both signals Haring's arrival as famous and expedites his production as an icon. In the Warholian context, the generation of multiple canvases with a silkscreen of Haring's image makes perfect sense. But what about the black boyfriend? Neither ever-present commodity nor media superstar, Juan Dubos might appear a curious subject for Warhol's reproduction of the period. But the Polaroids from which the silk screens are produced document and generate a defining relationship for Haring. The scene of bare-chested embrace enabled a series of iconic stills, temporal freezes that index Haring's notion of becoming other through his intimacy with a black man. Warhol's production machine does not seize Juan Dubos as subject in his own right, but rather mobilizes his fleshly proximity to Haring to cement the artist's public image as a lover of dark men. Warhol, as artist, uses Dubos to codify Haring socially. It is only within the context of the reproducibility of Haring's cross-racial relations that Dubos becomes an ideal subject here, in this instance, for pop reproduction. As a researcher interested in the operations of racism and the ways that subjects are eclipsed or diminished in the story of Haring's life, I produced a predictable narrative for Dubos and his historical treatment. To research Juan Dubos and the readily available sources on Haring's life is to witness the production of a brown and black sign that is an amalgamation of projections. A direct citation of Dubos's voice appears to be absent from the record. One might seek to somehow recover his voice through his own recorded history or the stories of others who knew him, and thereby to return to Dubos some of the agency and participatory and innovative complicity with racial fantasy that I have attributed to collaborators like Sang-Kwang Chi and Bill T. Jones. But I'm interested in Dubos as a counterpoint to the other figures in my book. The absence of his voice and the difficulty in locating alternative representations of him generates a productive resistance to the fantasy of a complete and correct narrative. The power of that fantasy and its dangers have been sensitively analyzed by Arnaldo Cruz-Malave in a 2007 book that provided a groundbreaking discussion of racial difference in Haring's life and work. In Queer Latino Testimonio, Keith Haring and Juanito Extravaganza, Cruz-Malave documents the oral history of Juan Rivera, the man who followed Dubos as Haring's Puerto Rican lover. Cruz-Malave's book presents a direct transcript of recorded interviews with Rivera, along with a separate chapter examining Haring's life and success through the lens of racial politics. Cruz-Malave shares with his reader his concern about the possible consequences of sharing Rivera's story with an audience that might be all too eager to consume the sensational tale of a down-and-out Puerto Rican. Entrusted by Rivera, who felt scorned by Haring's authorized biographer, with the task of telling his side of the story, Cruz-Malave asks, quote, "What if I was providing someone with a walk on the wild side so that someone, me included, could finally feel, could comprobar, both confirm and taste that joyous sigh of relief, that jolt that may be experienced at living lesser lives at a distance," end quote. In presenting this scene of complicity, Cruz-Malave demonstrates that the disenfranchised subject cannot free himself from the economy of desire that denies his agency or commits violence against him. In other words, the recovered voice that would finally set right the historical record can never be more than a fantasy. On a trip to Pittsburgh in 2005, that fantasy took a different form when I encountered Haring and Dubos, or rather the imagistic trace of them. After years of researching Haring and writing about the role of cross-racial desire in the production and consumption of his work, my own desires were suddenly reinvigorated upon seeing the Polaroids and acetate proofs filed in the collection of ephemera housed in the Andy Warhol Museum. I'd seen reproductions of the silkscreen paintings Warhol had produced from the photos, but the intensity of these recorded moments of contact, caught on the glossy surfaces of archived Polaroids, hit me viscerally. These scenes of radiant intimacy jarred me in their emotional force. The images display the lovers in a bare-chested embrace. In some shots, their lips touch. In others, they simply stare at the camera. What I had previously experienced as beautiful but cool abstractions on canvas became something altogether different in my contact with this primary material. In the minutes that I first came upon the photos, I wanted to strip off my white archive gloves and pull the images from their plastic casing in order to expose them as much as I possibly could. I wanted to feel my way into them by touching the material register of light, sensually engaging the photosensitive surfaces that had been in such close proximity to the lovers. Confronted with these Polaroids, images vibrating with the interracial contact that had become the focus of my academic project, I found myself in that fortunate but tricky space where new associations were being made, but their importance refused narrative coherence. Dubose can't be rescued from the scripts of race and power that frame his story, and those scripts were, of course, in play in the creation of the Warhol photo shoot, but the intimacy of the light writing in those images made that impossibility seem newly, productively disorienting. In writing Keith Haring's line, the unknowability of my subject has pulled me deeper into the archives of the queer artist and fueled a desire for contact with traces of Haring's life. And when I talk about archive here, I'm not talking just about like the institutional structure of the archive, but more generally the different materials that somehow have conjured Haring in some way. My book is written in acknowledgement of that desire and of that frustration, and it explores in particular how the impossible desire for the archive upsets the coherence of biographical narrative. This book in many ways maps my attempts to read an emotional call from the archive. It indulges an intense contact with the archive in order to excavate a futurity, a political possibility that vibrates in the records of Haring's past. Warhol's Polaroids, with their suggestion of immediacy, instant capture, and development, energize the fetish objects of the archive with the promise and hope of intimacy, an approximation to being there, to having been there. They also heighten my frustrations with the standard narrative that has come to represent the remarkable life of Keith Haring, and they allow me to access the something else of the archive. In other words, the sensorial affective experience of my own longing disrupts the fixed conceptions of who the artist was and what kind of effects his art had and continues to have on the world. In the particular silkscreen included in the exhibit, Warhol used multiple images from his photo session with Haring and Dubose. The result is a canvas in which their bodies blur in the center, as if the two men are pulling into each other and creating another being. The overlapping figures formally evoke Haring's fantasy about his relationship with Dubose. If Haring understood sexual intimacy as a powerful way to become non-white, to inhabit the otherness of his object of desire, this artistic expression represents a visual manifestation of that possibility. A figure of cross-racial contact seems to emerge from the distinct but convergent bodies of Haring and Dubose. Warhol's canvas both highlights and breaks apart bodily boundaries. While in the original Polaroids, the embracing lovers retain their distinct bodily contours, Warhol's collage and manipulation of light rewrites those bodies as an overlay, producing an alternate vision that yet retains the visible contours of their individual forms. Warhol's archive thus offers a trace of his creative practice. I get some sense of the steps between the capture of the image and the final silkscreen, a canvas that has always seemed to me to represent so perfectly the tensions and productions of my project. Compared with the smaller original Polaroids, the silkscreen with its central bodily blur, the impossible figure, seems bigger to me. Moreover, my glimpse into Warhol's process makes the silkscreen seem less coolly intellectual than I had once perceived it. I've characterized the image as indicative of Haring's desire for non-whiteness, and I believe that's a valid reading, but now I must understand the image in relation to my own desire. For it is definitely my desire that is hailed by the archival material related to Haring's life. This kind of animating potential of Warhol's work was perhaps best described for me in Roland Barthes' 1980 essay on pop art. Defined by its reproducibility and repetition, the Warholian subject in Barthes' account accesses a temporality distinct from that of classical portraiture. For Barthes, Warhol's reproductions resist the teleological conventions of historical being. The urgency of being as defined by death, what Barthes refers to as the pathos of time, is replaced in pop art by the facticity of the image itself, in which it is no longer important for a work to, quote, be given the internal organization of a destiny, birth, life, death, end quote. But the subject is not eradicated by this evasion of biography and teleology. Quote, however much pop art has depersonalized the world, platonized objects, dehumanized images, replaced traditional craftsmanship of the canvas by machinery, some subject remains, the one who looks in the absence of the one who makes, end quote. Naming the onlooker, the one who interprets and projects meaning onto the canvas, as the subject of the work, Barth argues that the essence of the Warholian image is the rhetorical process through which the social world codifies the figure. Neither the artist nor his subject is essential to the art piece. Rather, the work of art is its reception. In Warhol's archive, I'm left looking in the absence of those who made, overcome with the desire to imagine, to know in some way that moment of intimacy between Haring and Dubose. I'm confronted with the impossibility of knowing it and with my own process of projection. To some degree, I can name my compulsion to enter the scene of the photographs as conditioned by histories of loss and queer desire, the ongoing systemic violence against those with HIV, and the racist legacies of colonialism. Warhol's archive presents a process of mechanical reproduction around historical images, and as such, destabilizes the indexical relationship between the archival image and its referent. Like his silkscreen canvas, the documentary image from his archive demands that I engage in the act of its interpretation and interpolates me as the subject of the image. This is a scene of complicity, a complex field of negotiations in which I must accept the unknowable and pursue an interpretive project according to my own desires, shaped as it is by the social worlds and histories I inhabit. Haring, inspired by Warhol, allowed his line to be reproduced, to travel across surfaces into the hands of consumers in the form of t-shirts, buttons, and posters. This was a utopic project where he imagined a world in which everyone could own a piece of his art. In this distribution, the line loosens itself from the artist and the moments in which he painted or drew his designs, allowing it a signifying life beyond the corporeal life of Haring himself. This continued and unpredictable life of meaning was always inherent at Haring's line, both as a performance art project and as a graphic sign that indexed histories of contact and appropriation. My project, written in Haring's absence, represents my attempt to articulate an understanding of the artist's life and his line, that which Haring claims extends Warhol's legacy, mapping fields of cross-racial desire in order to enliven the line beyond the limiting conditions of a singular story about the artist. Thank you.
I also wanted to say thank you to Donna DeSalvo and Megan Hewer for including me in the symposium. I've been having a great time with conversations and presentations yesterday, and I'm just really grateful to be on this panel. Slick paperback covers, oversized format, the Statue of Liberty in silhouette against a silver sky. Our vantage point is from below and several yards away. She looms before us, larger than life, yet the scene fails to communicate the glory and promise this national icon is meant to symbolize. Instead, on the cover of Warhol's 1985 photo book, Lady Liberty is hardly discernible. She's cocooned in scaffolding and nearly eclipsed by the glare of a new day's sun. After 100 years of salt water and years of exposure to air pollution, her copper sheathing was wearing thin. At the top of the book's cover, in all capital letters, is Andy Warhol. Below her feet, the book's title, America. Opening the book, the title page inverts the cover. Here, Liberty is pictured from behind and above. The scaffolding has disappeared, and the sun overexposes her copper skin against a black sea. We gaze down on her as if passing by in an airplane. Above her upstretched arm, America. Below her feet, Andy Warhol. Despite the monumentality of its subject, the book feels light, empty, a little cheap. It begins in a television studio. A weatherman in a suit and tie gestures towards a map of the United States. Around him, the dark space of the studio suggests the black frame of an old television set. A few letters of text run over the top edge of the page and onto the next, like captions scrolling across the screen. I just wanted to shoot the whole book from TV. It would have been just easier, you see, because America on TV is so much easier, Warhol told Bob Edwards on NPR during the book tour. America follows the conventions of publishing: cover image, title page, epigraph, table of contents. Yet it also plays with these conventions. The swapping of author and title brings our attention to their relationship. Is it one of cause and effect, product and producer? By 1985, had Andy and America become synonymous? Inside, the photographs are printed at various angles and sizes, overlapping and bleeding over the margins, as if tossed onto the page in the rush from one exciting event to the next. While the layout suggests an accumulation of personal mementos, the book also points to the mass marketing publishing trade. 6 of the chapters take their titles from popular magazines: People, Physique Pictorial, National Geographic, Natural History, Vogue, and of course, Life. On the back cover, a small photograph shows Warhol riding in a convertible. And for those of you who were here yesterday, this is from the sequence that Richard Meyer showed from the contact sheets. So Warhol looks back at us from the passenger's seat, of course, not the driver's, and the promotional copy reads, "From the camera that never leaves his side," although obviously the camera has left his side because he's not taking the picture, "now comes a love letter, a remembrance, and an astonishing portrait of modern life, America. Culled from his 10-year archives, it is a work of blinding insight, a book of strange beauty and enormous contradictions." It turns out the contradictions in Warhol's book are as much about him as they are about the subject he depicts. Everybody, Warhol's book begins, has their own America, and then they have pieces of a fantasy America that they think is out there but they can't see. When I was little, I never left Pennsylvania, and I used to have fantasies about things that I thought were happening in the Midwest or down south or in Texas that I felt I was missing out on. But you can only live in one place at a time, and your life, while it's happening to you, never has any atmosphere until it's a memory. Playing up the first-person voice with its direct address to the reader and its evocation of a confessional, I used to have fantasies. The text reads more like a fantasy Warhol than the real one, and the critics were skeptical. The reviewer for Capital Times described Warhol as sounding as wide-eyed as Gomer Pyle, while the reviewer for People magazine proclaimed, "Warhol's talent may lie in convincing people that fraudulence is itself art, but he'll have a hard time persuading anyone this book is anything but dreary." Not only was America a hard sell with the critics, Warhol, in usual fashion, disavowed the book, saying, deflecting questions during the book tour with, "Oh, gee, I have no memory. I can't remember what I said, and I don't remember the pictures either." Warhol did record some memories, however, of working on the book in his diaries, his published diaries. He first mentions America on Saturday, September 24th, 1983. His diary reads, "Worked with Benjamin till 7, cab, $6. As we were talking about yesterday, the diaries also function as sort of bookkeeping, so he includes how much things cost. So worked with Benjamin till 7, cab, $6. Then the guy from Harper & Row who wants me to do the America book called and said he wanted to take me to dinner at Texarkana, and we'd meet at 9. Cab there, $6. It'll be a book of photographs with just a little text, maybe just captions." The editor, Craig Nelson, had sent Warhol a letter and a 3-page proposal outlining his really ambitious idea for a new book, which he was sort of building on the recent success of Exposures. Nelson's proposal reads, "It'll be an insider's look at a hidden society, a patriot's look at a country he loves so much, a collection of strong social commentary, and a fascinating work of art." But Warhol's account of their dinner foreshadows the trouble that's headed their way. Warhol's diary reads, "So after I'd sat there so long with this Harper and Row guy, Craig Nelson, he still hadn't gotten the check, and how long can you wait? So I just asked for the check, and he didn't offer to pay it. It was $100 with tip." While growing up in the Houston suburbs, Nelson had considered Warhol a spiritual superhero. So maybe he didn't want the dinner to end. I would have wanted to sit there for a while, too. A year goes by before Nelson and the book are mentioned again in the diaries. On November 26, 1984, the entry reads, "Had a talk with the Harper and Row editor, Craig Nelson, and had to tell him what I thought of what he'd written for the America book. He can't write," which is also really funny because, as I'll explain in a little bit, most of the writing in the America book is actually Warhol's patchwork of publications that Warhol had already written, so I don't really know what Craig had written that wasn't good. It's sort of saying, as Courtney did, see what the work is across the street and if it's any good, but in that case it was Warhol's show across the street, and in this case he's saying that Craig doesn't really write very well, but Craig is just kind of paraphrasing Warhol. Anyways, it's hard to know how much weight one should give Warhol's diary entries. Other sources on the book's production and on Warhol's relationship with Nelson are sparse. The few pieces of correspondence about America in the time capsules at the Andy Warhol Museum archives were enlightening. But the finding aids for the time capsules are not publicly accessible, so one must rely on the time and generosity of the archivists to help and search for relevant material. Thus, Warhol's diaries provide the most detailed account of his last decade, but we should not take it as the whole story. When I interviewed Nelson, he said that Pat Hackett had, for some reason, removed his name from all of the scenes in which he and Warhol were out and about doing things. But to my knowledge, the diaries are not publicly accessible or open to researchers, so there was no way I could confirm this story from Nelson. And I'm eager to hear from other scholars who have, I think, been able to access the diaries. America was published during the period of Warhol's career in which he pursued several corporate endorsements and promotional gimmicks. I didn't watch the Super Bowl, but I guess there was something with his hamburger eating again. And I agree with Trevor Fairbrother that although the book may look like a covert self-portrait born at a time of personal doubt, middle age, professional anxiety, lousy romances, poor health, and AIDS paranoia, it is important to remember that America was a commercial product with a business strategy. Warhol's name plus nationalist sentiment equal bestseller. The publishing house was surely attracted by the lucrative possibility of combining Warhol's fame with Reagan-era nationalism. But the deal was meant to be reciprocal. According to Nelson, Warhol's work was in a bit of a trough at the time, and the book was meant to help get his visibility up a little bit. It built on existing successes at the publishing house as well. You see, Nelson had secured a contract with Laurie Anderson to publish a book version of her critically acclaimed multimedia performance, United States. As Nelson explained, I was able to get that book to get Andy to work with me. I find it interesting that Anderson's United States and Warhol's America were edited by the same editor. They're actually designed by the same designer and published by the same publisher. Both take the nation as their subject. Both use the theme of the road trip to elucidate it. Both employ techniques of appropriation, repetition, accumulation, photographic reproduction, and irony. And they were released 1 year apart. Despite these similarities, Warhol's America remains merely a picture book. As the New York Times put it, a, quote, hodgepodge of the garish, the perverse, and the beautiful, or, as according to the Washington Post, a collection of photographs of the fey and famous. Warhol's 15 minutes, it seems, were up. But Warhol's America is more than an unsuccessful sequel to Anderson's United States. For me, Warhol's America enacts the issues of reading and misreading, of power and authorship that Anderson's work explains. And I should say that I think of America not only as a material object, as a book, or as a text, but also the whole life world of the creation and circulation of that text. So I think that Warhol really pushes us to thinking about publishing and book history in this expanded way. Chapter 6 opens with a double spread of an airplane. At the top left, running across the gutter and onto the facing page, is the chapter's title. In the bottom left corner, below the wing of the airplane, the text begins. For my second row at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles, the Liz Elvis show, I rode cross-country from New York in a station wagon with Wynne Chamberlain, Taylor Mead, and Gerard Malonga. It was a beautiful time to be driving across America. I'd never been west of Pennsylvania on the ground before. You might recognize that line because it was originally published in Popism 5 years before, so he's just repeating himself here. On the next page, the rest of the chapter title runs across the top, and we find ourselves inside an airplane. On the right is an aerial view of beach houses in Montauk. The photograph bleeds over onto the next two-page spread, and we are presented with more views of the beach. As the photographs narrate plane travel, the text retells the story of Warhol's American road trip. The farther west we drove, Warhol writes, the more pop everything looked on the highways. Suddenly we all felt like insiders because even though pop was everywhere, that was the thing about it. Most people still took it for granted, whereas we were dazzled by it. There's a political dimension to Warhol's pop way of seeing. As Jonathan Flatley puts it, a faggy, pasty white working-class queer from Pittsburgh, with such as Warhol, was unlikely as anyone to find representations of himself, his desires, or his experiences inside the public sphere. Warhol's way of looking was a form of survival. Anderson also takes to the road in the United States. You're driving alone at night, and it's dark, and it's raining, and you took a turn back there, and you're not sure how now that it was the right turn, but you took the turn anyway, and you just keep going in this direction. Eventually, it starts to get light, and you look out, and you realize you have absolutely no idea where you are. For both Warhol and Anderson, reading defines the road. But for Warhol, the strangeness and indeterminacy of the signs along the highway propel him and his friends forward toward a new way of looking and seeing and being dazzled by the world, while Anderson pulls over and gets out at the next gas station to ask, "Hello, excuse me, can you tell me where I am?" The car, the road, America, from Francis Picabia's portrait of a nude American girl in the form of a spark plug to Warhol's car crashes, the automobile has served as a symbol of America, and the road trip has become the classic subject of the American photo book. Premised on the photographer who was taken to the road and traveled through America's towns and cities, visited its bathrooms and barbecues, Warhol's book follows, and you might say subverts or negates, the tradition of Walker Evans' American Photographs and Robert Frank's The Americans. There are no blank pages in Warhol's photo book. Its cover is silver rather than black, its format magazine size, its binding glued, its paper slick, its typography the opposite of elegant. It looks like a mass-produced scrapbook. But of course, Warhol was the master of the scrapbooker's craft. From his soup cans to his movie stars, he culled and clipped and saved and repurposed the printed matter around him. He even began to recycle his own material around this time in his retrospective and reversal series, which mined and recombined his pop iconography. A similar technique was used to write the text for America, although it was Nelson, not Warhol, who was doing the cutting and pasting. For example, in the first chapter of America, Warhol writes about shopping and all the choices available to consumers. After a paragraph long list of beverages, which are kind of funny if you can see them. There's like pineapple, apple grape, apple cherry. They're really weird, pina colada. Anyways, after all these beverages, he exalts. And not only are there all these choices, but it's all democratic. You can see a billboard for Tab and think, Nancy Reagan drinks Tab, Gloria Vanderbilt drinks Tab, Jackie Onassis drinks Tab, Katharine Hepburn drinks Tab, and just think, you can drink Tab too. 10 years after this quip was originally published in The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again, and we seem to be back again, then it was Coke as the beverage of choice. Warhol's tongue-in-cheek take on American democracy had lost its edge, not least of all because of the lame joke embedded in making all the drinkers female and changing the beverage to Tab, which was a diet cola marketed to those who wanted to keep tabs on their weight. The text for America is a patchwork of golden oldies and new ventriloquisms by his editor, and the premise that the images were culled from his 10-year archive was also a hoax, or partially a hoax. As Nelson told me, an awful lot of the pictures turned out to not be that interesting in the archives. So a lot of my work was actually dragging Andy out to do things, to take new pictures for the book, to give him a fresher, more interesting look. So for the wrestlers, I took him to a wrestling show. And then I took him to see the Statue of Liberty for the cover. Ooh, but I wanted to say, sorry, patchwork of golden oldies, because yesterday Richard put up this photograph, which actually here it's been kind of zoomed in on, and you can see, obviously we're returning to the Mona Lisas, which in the exhibition you see the early silk screen from the pop period where 30 are better than one, and then later in the 80s with his large monochrome painting of the Mona Lisas. And here in the 1985 sort of photo book, you have the Mona Lisa again. So this recursiveness of his process and referencing his iconography slips in so many interesting ways, I think. Oh, sorry. So and then I took him to see Statue of Liberty for the cover. So a huge number of images in that book were actually created just for the book instead of the archives, even though I did go through the fucking archives, Greg said. And having worked in Warhol's archives, I understand. After Nelson finished getting the images and organizing them into thematic sections, they were handed over to the book's designer, Barbara Richer. She said, "It was fun because I was really given free rein. The photos came to her in several boxes, and she designed the whole book as one piece over a weekend." Warhol's America not only perpetuated the cliche of the road trip, it necessitated he go on one. The promotional tour was nothing short of a grueling disaster. It lasted 3 months and included interviews with the press, radio appearances, autographing sessions, champagne receptions, slide presentations, and even a recording session for an in-flight magazine. I've not been able to find a copy of that, but maybe Melissa has in her research in the audio archive. It began at B. Dalton's in Greenwich Village. The signing was well attended, but Warhol had expected a better turnout. The next Wednesday, he did a signing at the Rizzoli bookstore in Soho. There was a large crowd. Nelson stepped out to smoke a cigarette. A young woman in line stepped forward when it was her turn. She handed Warhol her book, but rather than ask him for his photograph, she yanked the wig off his head and tossed it to an accomplice who ran out of the store. The staff at Rizzoli asked Warhol if he wanted to stop, but there was still a long line, so he pulled the hood of his coat over his head and continued to sign, I think, for another 2 hours. For 3 days, Warhol postponed telling his account of the incident in his diaries. Only after he read Liz Smith's gossip column in the Daily News did he amend his diary. He writes, "I guess I can't put it off any longer." But he never actually says what happened to him. The girl did what she did. It was too unusual. It was so shocking. It hurt. It was like a movie. It was like getting shot again. There were so many cameras. Warhol seems only able to come to terms with the violence he experienced as a witness to someone else's tragedy. Witnessing desire, in this case, witnessing disaster, in this case, a personal disaster in the form of public humiliation, is one of the primary ways in which the contradictory requirements of embodiment and abstraction come into view. Embodiment and abstraction, window and mirror, nihilist and clown. In America, Warhol writes, "Dying is the most embarrassing thing that can ever happen to you because someone's got to take care of all your details. You've died and someone's got to take care of the body. make the funeral arrangements, pick out the casket and the service and the cemetery and the clothes for you to wear, and get someone to style you and do all the makeup. You'd like to help them, and most of all, you'd like to do the whole thing yourself, but you're dead, so you can't. It's a shame. I never understood why when you died, you just didn't vanish, and everything could just keep going the way it was, only you just wouldn't be there. I always thought I'd like my own tombstone to be blank. No epitaph, no name. Well, actually, I'd like it to say Figment. Warhol certainly didn't vanish, as this symposium and exhibition are a testament to, and he left a lot of stuff behind when he died. His house was so full of furniture, art, jewelry, and other collectibles that it took Sotheby's a 6-volume catalog to auction it off, or to describe the auction lots. There were also hundreds of time capsules, thousands of cassette tapes, the films, photographs, and paintings. There was the magazine business, and there was, of course, his diary, as kept by Pat Hackett. Beginning in the 1970s, Hackett would telephone Warhol every morning, and he would recount his activities from the previous day, noting all his business expenses. The diaries became a method of bookkeeping and part of his daily routine. After Warhol's death, Stephen M.L. Aronson, who had been Warhol's most frequent book editor and the editor of The Philosophy, introduced Hackett and Fred Hughes, who was the executor of Warhol's estate, to the literary agent Lynn Nesbitt, who sold the diaries to Warner Books for $1.2 million in June 1987. It took Aronson and Hackett nearly 2 years to edit the over 20,000 typed pages into a publishable book. Strategically, they decided to not include an index of names. Aronson explains, thousands of people unable to spend time standing in bookstores and looking themselves up were forced to invest in it, take it home, and sit down and read it until they came to their names or didn't. The strategy worked. The first printing of 110,000 copies sold out. And actually, there were like 2 underground publications that people produced their own indexes, and then you could buy those. They were really interesting. The reviews were laudatory. A vivid picture of this enigmatic man, declared the Philadelphia Inquirer. The ultimate self-portrait, claimed the Boston Globe. Warhol finally got a bestseller. This was his only bestseller. The diaries may well be as close as we can get to knowing what Warhol thought, but for me, it is not the diaries. It is America, with its weird cast of characters, its incident of violation, and its enduring contradictions that stand as the allegory of a life. The graying lips, the shaggy silver white hair, soft and metallic, the cords of the neck standing out around the big Adam's apple. It's all there, B. Nothing is missing. I'm everything my scrapbook says I am. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, wonderful. So thank you for such a series of very rich presentations. And I thought I'd initially start off our discussion with a few questions among us, and then we could open it up the floor to the audience. And just to give Lucy a break, I thought I'd first pose my question to Jonathan and Ricardo, and I was particularly struck by how the to quote Bart, how the demon of analogy was working, like in both of your works, like especially Jonathan, your use of the term mimesis, or how Warhol's paintings function as a kind of aesthetic analog to something like the organization of Star, or Ricardo, your discussion about this kind of becoming other, a kind of mimetic becoming other via more a different kind of or related cross-racial desire. And while I was hearing your descriptions, both of your descriptions about this functioning of a certain kind of mimesis, I was also struck by both of your description of a certain kind of intimacy, like that you have with these works, like that it provokes a particular kind of close viewing, like even though the performances also resist that not too close inspection. I think, Jonathan, that was your term. And what it means to the very nature of these works that produce a close desire to look closely, but also incites a kind of not seeing at the same time, and especially around the kind of functioning of the lines. I could go on a bit, but perhaps I could ask you to speak a little bit more about this relationship with the spectator, about this incitement of a close viewing, but also this the sense of resistance, these gaps, like these redactions, like the functioning of the line that draws ourselves to a surface that we not necessarily want to see through, but see on with its interruptions and disruptions.
I mean, I think that, so just to say, when I first saw the silk screen with the overlapping bodies was in the first edition of the Keith Haring journals. And so it was just a remarkable image to me and exciting to me only because I was like thinking about this fantasy of becoming other and Haring's attachment to this idea of overcoming his whiteness through sexual intimacy. So there was this Warhol image. I was like, okay, what is happening here to the kind of contours of the body? But I mean, increasingly it is, and I think it relates to what was discussed yesterday around the shadow, was about like the kind of, there's a kind of affective shock in the, it's not a blur, and I keep talking about it as a kind of blur in the center, but it's actually kind of the shadow working across these bodies. It's very destabilizing to me, especially, I think, spending so much time with Haring and his artifacts and with Juan Dubos's absence is very, just, it's hard. It's hard to deal with that loss. And there's so many losses embedded in this research project in many ways. And so for me, the kind of, it's remarkable to me that when the Polaroid, I mean, it's obvious to me the way that I fetishize the Polaroid as being a kind of intimate, instant kind of place of capture. And at the same time, like, I don't really think of it as kind of some pure representation of intimacy, and people have misread the work, and that would say, like, I mean, I've had people like, you don't understand Warhol because there's nothing intimate about his Polaroids, and I'm like, well, anyway, but for me, it's kind of in that abstraction, in that production of the acetates and the kind of development of that shadow, there's something affectively shocking to me about what I am doing, even in like trading in the imagery or thinking about the imagery or enacting my desire according to these screens.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say something brief, maybe. I made to think more about that Baraka poem, which is such a great poem. I mean, I feel like for Warhol, the thing about similarity or mimesis or, sort of imitation is that imitation can bring two things or two people into relation with each other without erasing their difference, indeed, like highlighting their difference. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the Ladies and Gentlemen series, like a lot of Warhol's work, is like really about that. Is about a sort of shared imitation that allows one to think about, and as Marsha P. Johnson talks about, brings these street transvestites together, their shared imitation of stardom, their shared imitation of femininity, and makes them similar, not sort of directly because they're imitating each other, but because they have this sort of shared relationship to stardom and glamour in a way that draws them together without sort of erasing difference or something. I mean, for me, well, there's a lot to like. I mean, whatever, in terms of my own relation to it, I'm just really impressed, and I feel like Neil Prince's catalog, Raisonné, does a lot of this work by the volume, by the sort of size of the group, and by Warhol's commitment to document and represent the group as a group, and his efforts to, I mean, I also kind of read Warhol's, loneliness. He wishes he could be part of this group. He's kind of trying in the paintings to imitate the work that they're doing as a way to kind of participate in the way that he sees their friendliness and affection, which also speaks to the way that maybe he felt left out of that space of affection and friendliness and conviviality. So I think that's there as well.
Thank you. Yes, I was quite struck by that scene. I think it's something that's been resonating throughout the symposium, is what it means to think about the singularity of a work and its scale, especially with the Ladies and Gentlemen series, like where some of the paintings, the scale of them are quite large, but if you see it in relationship to this 500 like Polaroids, and especially reading your chapter, I couldn't help from the recent book, I mean, just the I couldn't help, while I was walking through the exhibition, to really focus on the attention to surface in a way that I hadn't done before, and what it means to not just think of this only in formal terms, but how the formal translates a certain kind of desire to become the other, but a certain resistance to any kind of hermeneutics of depth, or so no pulling off the wig. And that we might still embrace the disjointedness of those coming together. It's but there will be no pulling apart, and how that's formally translated into a very tactile kind of, actually blur was the word that I was thinking about. And maybe that would actually lead us to the question I wanted to ask Lucy. It was wonderful to think about, as a non-Warhol scholar, I've been fascinated by the seemingly almost obsessive interest in his diaries as an artist, and it's a certain training that I've received of a certain resistance to the biographical and the monograph. As much as we rely on the archive, but that there is a certain play in the close looking and not close looking that Warhol's work itself produces that requires a kind of obsessive compulsive desire to hear everything, to see everything, and yet that doesn't unlock, it never will, And so, and I was quite interested, Lucy, in your displacement of that, the finding of Warhol from the diary to the road trip, and to think about the blur, of the side view, that is embraced in this relationship to where do we find Warhol, who is Warhol. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that in relationship to the composition of the book, which you articulated. Yes.
Yeah, I think that was one way that our three projects kind of connected, I think, was the dispersal, where you're looking at each of your projects. It's not just one body of work, but then there's, the Polaroid behind the silk screen, or the prints in addition to the paintings. And you, Ricardo, that image of the silkworm, the way that you totally exploded the work so that it's not just the Polaroid and then the painting, but it's actually the worm whose cocoon, it provides the silk, and that seemed to really, maybe I'm overplaying it, but to Jonathan's point about the inequality that is the prompt and premise for all of these works, and unheard voices or unseen participators or collaborators. And I think that you're right. I want to get into the archives and listen to everything, and where are those 20,000 type pages? And someone said that the diaries were from tape recordings, and I thought they were just Pat listening on the phone and then taking down notes. And where are those notes? And did his name get? There's this OCD hunting, definitely. And then yet it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't help, it just obscures those other voices more. I think part of what I wanted to do in writing this book was to not only think about publishing in a different way, but also to draw out all those collaborators, those other voices who, designed the book, typed the pages with the not, all of that is, there's no I in Warhol, as we learned. And so I think that you both did that, the works that you talked about today also force us to move beyond a single object to a group, or I don't know. I thought it was beautiful what you said about the silkworm.
No, I think the methodological implications of looking at Warhol in this way, not just as the monographic singular artist, but what kind of looking that it compels us, and what kind of looking, reading, and writing it compels. And rather, I was quite struck by Jonathan, where you were making that comparison, a comparison contrast between the play of light and darkness in the stills from the screenshots versus the play of surface, in the painting, is that it's not so much a break from the earlier work to the later work, but the later work seems to allow us to intensify the way that it's not actually about bringing out these obscured voices from the shadows. The shadow actually has a different quality, that actually a lot of the work, and I think that's also why it's very difficult and challenging to write, is that it seems to be that we're not the work demands us not to bring light to Warhol, but to actually bring out the quality of his obscurity, right? And what that obscurity entails, because it's not the I, because it's always not, but it's not I, nor is it a we, but it's constantly in relation. And so, especially when we, as those who pose questions and inquire and are sort of compelled to answer, like what it means for our own writing and scholarship and delivery to actually maintain and actually write about the obscure, and that to work through it is to actually revel ever more in our not seeing. Yes.
I think that's so right, and I guess that what I was trying to say with the America book is that's why it seems more like the portrait of the enigmatic man than the diaries do, because it's just so, it announces its artificiality so upfront and just like quoting itself, and the whole story around it just seems to be more accurate in its inaccuracy to represent him.
I mean, I would say just about, I feel like being with Warhol or having to go to Warhol's archives to research Haring is like a kind of, a sort of helps me think about a performative methodology around opacity itself as a researcher, as a scholar.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that, and let me, one more question I wanted to I was very curious to hear Jonathan and Ricardo, you too, actually speak in relationship to this cross-racial desire. But and that's one of the reasons I was thinking about the Baraka poem. We started the symposium on the shadow, but like what happens when the shadow actually is understood as a certain kind of disavowed, like disavowed presence of blackness, like in the American fantasy, and if we're not going to return to or resort to more liberal narratives of redemptive, give the subject a voice, like how do you give form to that presence? Like how do you speak about cross-racial desire, which is neither redemptive or similarly critical? And I was particularly struck, Ricardo, by your use of the term complicity. But I was curious to see you two in dialogue around that complicity, around the relationship between the artist and his models.
I mean, I was just really taken with the idea of like thinking about Warhol's liking in relation to Haring's kind of becoming as a kind of way of I mean, so it's very difficult to talk about Haring because it is such a kind of fetishizing imagination of becoming that other person and sort of disavowing whiteness on some level, but it's also like a mode of entry of thinking politically about the world and being together in difference in the ways that I think that you're mapping around Andy and his subjects.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, I don't know if I would describe Warhol's work with the ladies and gentlemen as cross-racial identification, so much as an effort, this sort of his ongoing effort to think about the ways that practices of imitation can cross the color line without pretending that the color line doesn't exist, right? Maybe as a way to kind of de-reify the color line as a kind of absolute marker of difference, and to think about the ways that all kinds of voluntary practices that one engages in, such as fandom, are ways of joining together with others in a kind of messy realm of mixed subjectivities across the color line, and that's part of the appeal of fandom. And I sort of feel like, I mean, I read those the Maryland diptych as a kind of representation of cross-racial identification. James Baldwin talks about like identifying with Marilyn Monroe. And there's that great passage in Jose Muñoz's Disidentifications. He's talking about Basquiat, and he's talking about cross-racial identification among spectators. And I feel like this is what Warhol's doing with that work, and in a way, I mean, it's not a liberal kind of like we're all people or we're all the same or what. I mean, I think it's not that, but it doesn't also necessarily lead immediately to a clear political vision. Although in the case of the ladies and gentlemen, the handiness or the adjacency of Starr as a very explicit political group based precisely on kind of similarity rooted in spectatorial practices, one can see how that would have been especially attractive to Warhol, given his already long-standing interest in thinking about how similarity can create modes of being together or collectivity across differences that are otherwise reified or seem to be barriers across which it's difficult to produce solidarity, political solidarity.
And I should say, I thought it was very important, actually, to intervene into this rhetoric around like, because the term likeness or like affinity, like grouping social groups around liking, is one of the primary modes of social segregation. Like that, it's if you think about the way that gentrification works, like the way what it means to create affinity groups in a very particular way, like through their tastes and preferences, but likes, like not just through appearances, and how that is being mobilized, especially in today in certain moments of policing and surveillance. But then not to concede the relationship through likeness only to the logic of surveillance and what it means to hold on to creating the possibility of a collective, not through notions of identification, but a series of slippages and likenesses, which I think we need to hold on to, especially as the like rather than the identity is increasingly where control is taking place.
I agree.
I think maybe this is a good time, to open up the floor to any questions. Yes. Richard, yes.
Those were wonderful. Thank you. I learned so much. I have questions for each of you, but happily, I'm not going to ask each of you a question because it would take too long. So I'm going to ask what I think is my most difficult question, which happens to be for Ricardo. And I was thinking about quotes from all three papers, but I mean quotes where you guys quote other people. But the quote that really stuck with me, and I think with you too, is the one by Keith Haring where he talks about his attraction to men of color, and it ends with something like, it's as close as I could get to being him.
Truly becoming, yeah.
Becoming him. And I guess, so this is the maybe difficult and slightly unfashionable thing that I want to ask about. Edmund White writes this essay about Robert Mapplethorpe, where he talks about Mapplethorpe's images of black men, not as racial, as he acknowledges, but he talks about them as courageous for putting the white guys, gay white photographers' desire for black men, for not only acknowledging it, but for making it into representation so that everyone has to see the way in which his desire and desire itself is racialized. Mm-hmm. And I think that in your paper, it seemed to me that moment became about this idea of sexual colonization or this appropriation, instead of actually what Coco Fusco says, well, if you just go into a porn shop and there's all these sections about, where you could find different cross-racial pairings, and obviously sexuality and fantasy, we have to sort of talk openly about, or we could, maybe it would be helpful to talk openly about the ways in which, to different degrees, lots of people, including people of color, may racialize desire. And so my question is about, what about speculating on the person of color's desire for a white partner? In other words, you talked a lot about Keith Haring, and obviously there's much more material. You talked somewhat also about your own desire in terms of the archive, but I'm wondering about Juan de Bos. Let's say, at least the desire that he generated for Keith Haring when they were a couple, before he, then desired drugs perhaps more than Keith Haring. And I feel like that's become somewhat unspeakable now, this cross-racial desire for whiteness as anything other than a kind of desire for one's own oppression. And it seems really important to talk about in terms of the reciprocity of what it means to be, hopefully, in an intimate relationship with someone. I mean, the fetishization doesn't only go in one direction.
Right. I mean, I think that in the larger project, and I feel like sometimes when I do start with a passage like that that is using very fixed terms of identification, let's say, of becoming other. But the book and the project of thinking, why I think about Haring's line is I understand that sort of appropriative energy of Haring's line is not just being a kind of a white person appropriating this line from primitive culture or from graffiti, but in fact a kind of ongoing negotiation with difference itself, that the line, the kind of the unending signifying potential of the line actually has in it the capacity to kind of work through, to animate, to think about cross-racial desire in all sorts of directions. So it's not just about a kind of, I'm a white person desiring a black person, but in fact it's a kind of like announcing the various ways that desire is animated through racial logics, whether or not those racial logics necessarily make total sense even in the act of desire itself, but that it's a kind of, it's always animating or showing a kind of a differentiating that continues to spark more movement and more animation. And so in some sense, yes, there is a kind of mobility for, quote unquote, the brown subject to like the white subject, but it's kind of also beyond that sort of fixed dynamic as well.
Yes, I see. A question from, yes.
Thank you so much. Those were really 4 fantastic, or 3.5 fantastic talks. I kind of hate you for them because I'm going to have to go into 4 different chapters in my own work on Warhol and change things because of today. So I resent you for that. A little gift to you, Lucy. I found the source of the Figment quote, and it's not in Warhol at all. It's someone else who's saying it, and Warhol says, "Oh, yeah." So in fact, it's not even Warhol talking at the very beginning of the Figment quote.
Which quote?
The Figment. What I want on my tombstone is a figment. It's actually a journalist who says, "So you'd really like to say that you want to be a kind of figment of the American imagination?" And he says, "Oh, yeah." You know, in an incredibly obscure little newspaper. I can't remember where it was from anymore. But Jonathan, a question for you, and maybe a few bits of information that might be useful. The question is, do you think that Warhol's encounter with Marsha Johnson really came about in the way that the sort of cliched story about the ladies and gentlemen is told? That is, do you think she was really working at the Gilded Grape or on the Far West Side turning tricks? Or do you think Warhol, that encounter happened in another way? I just don't have a clear sense of what Marsha Johnson was doing sort of day to day in her life at that time. And then a little piece of information, which is that I looked into the prices people were paying for life models at that moment. And it looks as though the standard fee was about $4 an hour for a life model. So it was very, very low. And then I looked into the standard fee that transvestites earned for turning tricks, and it was about $10 an hour. And it occurred to me that maybe the closest analog to what Warhol was paying, the $100 he was paying, and Lucy can sort of back me up in this, is the kind of amounts he was paying to his own superstars for appearing in movies. When you look at the contracts, or for that matter in the book, Ondine gets $200, right, in the contract for A, or in at least one of the first contracts.
Yeah, I don't remember how much. I don't know that he got paid at all. I know there's a release, but yeah.
There's a release for $200. So those are kind of the amounts that seem to be closer to the $100 that the transvestites were getting. So I wonder if that somehow makes a different sense of the ladies and gentlemen, that they're being incorporated into the economic framework that governed Warhol's underground films and some of his earliest books.
Yeah, that's a great question, and really good thoughts. I mean, Neil knows better. Neil knows this better than I. So. He's seen all these sort of all the documents. No, I mean, I don't think Bob Colacello's story is like whatever. It's classic. It's like mostly accurate, but it's also with like Bob's kind of his like bitchiness like added in or whatever, and his sense of like superiority to these like transvestite prostitutes that are hanging out at the Gilded Grape. I think it's likely that one of the other people who was getting models for Warhol, maybe Vincent Fremont, brought in Marsha. No, who do you think Neil brought? It was Ronnie Coutron.
The one with the Mary Hartman braids, and as you pointed out, Mary Hartman hadn't been televised at that point. And generally the fee was $50. There were two, it was generally, I don't have all the information. No one, as you people have so beautifully pointed out today, has all the information. We will never have all the information. Here's to not
But you have
having.
more information.
Yeah, I have a lot. I spend a lot of time. So there are $50 checks, mostly when we have checks, and we don't have all the checks. God knows the lives they lived if they could, if they even cashed the checks. Henry, AKA Helen Morales, who we saw yesterday, who I showed yesterday, also received a check like Wilhelmina for $100. And the story with, and Corey Tippin was the other person who brought people in. And Corey's very involved with transgender people, still is, and he's fascinated by it. We discussed this, and he said, and he felt exactly as it appeared on the checks, Blake, model services. They're models. And I think the way to think about it is a modeling fee. Maybe not in an art school, maybe not $4 an hour, but what would a fashion model get? I didn't do that research, but generally it would be $50 for a single session. Helen came back a second day for a second session, according to Corey, because she was so funny. You look at the Polaroids, you look at the paintings, and you can see that manic wit going. So she received $100 as well. For 2 sessions. And the interesting thing is when Helen showed up the second day, she looked completely different. Not like a different movie star necessarily, but totally transformed, a total transformation. So this sense, and I think you really talked it beautifully, Jonathan, this sense of transformation and looking at something and transforming yourself in terms of it is so intense in that series, so beautiful in that series.
Just to say, to repeat, as a non-Warhol scholar, I just love that, and it sort of speaks to the concerns of the first day, how Lucy was mentioning where the diary becomes a kind of bookkeeping at the same time, and again, and I was particularly struck what it means to consistently have to talk about the material conditions of what it means to not just to work for Andy, but to be in his presence, and it means that it necessitates how we talk about circulation on so many levels altogether to be able to give an account, which is really striking in these examples. Do we have one? Yes.
No.
We're out of time. Yes. Okay. Great. Yes.
So each of your presentations were so extraordinary and each quite distinct because you identified very particular kinds of relationships that were model, artist, friend, and much more personal with Keith Haring, and then this kind of more formalized book project. And it really struck me to think about, and I think at the beginning was just talking about the imbalance in the power relationship, which sort of threads throughout so many of these collaborations, which is a problematic term here. But what really struck me was thinking, and it hasn't come up because we are very focused on the 70s and 80s, but the model that Warhol experienced in the 50s is working with the art director. And that in that realm, Warhol would sometimes sign his illustrations, sometimes they wouldn't be signed, and the art director essentially really draws on his talent. So it just strikes me really in a really interesting way that that model for Warhol, maybe the 60s is a little different because I think the films was a very different kind of scenario in terms of people attracted to Warhol. They all had their own pathology and agenda, but it gets much more formalized into the 70s and 80s, maybe as a result of the shooting and the factory changes, it's by appointment. It becomes almost more corporate in a way. But I was just struck by that idea of, Warhol becomes the art director, the producer, the director. Bob Calicello gets really annoyed and he quits. Some people feel exploited. I remember, in some of the documentaries that have been done, listening to Taylor Mead, who had tremendous anger because they were very poor, many of these characters, or they sadly jumped out of windows or died from drug overdoses. But it just strikes me that in a way, the 70s and 80s seem almost more analogous to aspects of the 1950s. And I just wonder how, just to hear any of your thoughts about that concept of what an art director is, which is usually, there's a certain invisibility somehow to the other talent. And you're talking a lot about some notions of invisibility here in terms of whether it's an artist model. I think the Haring thing is a little different, and I was curious, Ricardo, was Keith ever angry? I mean, did he ever feel, you don't get the sense he felt exploited by Warhol. The Harper and Row thing is Warhol kind of getting fed up with them in a certain way, and the publisher becomes like the illustrator in a funny way. So one question is about Haring, and then the second question is maybe if people have any comment on that idea of art director.
I think that something that's really interesting about Haring is that his attitude in the documents that I've read is so counter to the cynicism of other people who worked under Warhol. He doesn't have that resentment. In fact, he's totally fascinated by, he's just kind of in awe of Warhol's capacity and precisely the kind of industry that you're speaking to in this art director capacity. And that's what he wants to what he imagines is that utopic way in which his vision of his line can get out there, can get distributed. And it's not about a kind of the people that he's working with necessarily, but about Haring having this kind of utopic vision that will draw a bunch of people together and who will share in his art or the capacity of his art. But he is so enthusiastic about Warhol and in totally non-cynical ways. It's kind of remarkable.
It's interesting in the case of the Ladies and Gentlemen works also to think about the commission, the status of the commissioner, and Anselmino in this sense, who initiates the project and comes up with the idea for the project and also, provides the money. Without it's like $1 million. It's a huge amount of money that he's laying out that really, proved a strong motivating force for Warhol there. So to return, the sort of earlier question about his, I don't think he had a especially exploitative relation to the models, and I think he if you look at the photos of his photo shoots, it's very affectionate. But that there is a structural inequality there is unavoidable, and it's interesting that Calicello cites Holly and Jackie as being they'd want money every time a painting sold, because they don't have any money, and Warhol's just it's coming in. So that's sort of part of the situation, structurally part of the situation. So I feel like it's, to speak to the art director thing, it's also the collaboration or the sort of agency in the production of the work in all of these settings seems to be fairly distributed among a number of different actors in interesting ways.
Do you think, so just one last follow-up then, do you think that because especially in the 70s and the 80s, many things are commissioned, and sometimes it leads to great work, and I think sometimes it leads to really not very good work. But it's an interesting dynamic in that sense of the dealer acting almost like the art director, and then Warhol responds. He's given the idea, so to speak, which is what the art director would do in all of the great I. Miller ads. There's also Peter Palazzo who's orchestrating it all. So it just struck me, it's interesting, that whole idea of, with Bischofberger, Anselmino, so many dealers who, and sometimes Warhol doesn't do it, like the Mao portrait where he doesn't want to do Albert Einstein. He says, no, I'm going to do Mao. But, a lot of the work that comes in during that period of time, the 70s and 80s, are really the result of these commissions. And in a sense, he's sort of given the idea and then he executes. but he has more agency than he did, in the old days when he was the commercial illustrator.
I mean, in a way, it's like that ad that he put in the Village Voice in the 60s or whatever. It's like, I'll endorse anything for money, whatever you want me to endorse, I'll, S&M, whatever, I'll endorse it. So I feel like this getting commissions is a kind of ideal for Warhol, because he also talks about, I guess in the philosophy and other places, how he really loves having a boss. He just wishes he could have a boss to tell him what to do. Yeah, right.
I think one way that we can sum up so much of the discussions around this panel is how much thinking through with against Warhol allows us to really complicate any notions of agency and reciprocity, like that the very idea that we can actually have agency and not be exploited is itself a fantasy that hinges on the disavowal of other people's exploitation, so that it actually suspends, it's not a question about exploiting, whether you exploit or not, is that we're all exploited, but that hierarchy of exploitation also is contingent on others, and how do we account for that in our modes of production and reception? So to suspend any sense of, or suspend at least that liberal idea of agency and choice. So thank you. Yes.